Now, what we're looking at doing across the country is engaging in a series of what is called a judicial determination, where the practices and the policies of the government and their agents, whether or not it's actual or potential, you can go before the court and ask them to review these actions, compare it to the legislation, and determine whether or not their actions are outside the bounds of the authority granted to them in that legislation. We're going to be asking a series of questions. Basically, all of these questions boil down and will reveal the truth of certain things, certain deceptions that the people in the government certainly do not want revealed. Now, if they try to stop us from engaging in this judicial determination, then clearly they simply don't want the answers. And that means they're very, very, very bad government. Now, these are all very simple questions. The answers have to be secured one way or another. What I would like to see happen is very simply, simple questions answered by the courts, and then the cops are bound by this new reality, this new truth. Some of the key questions, of course, have to do with who really has the authority. Are we children of the state? Are we compelled to obey their orders because we're in possession of government-issued identification? Or is this a common law country, a common law jurisdiction where equality is paramount? Now, these are the fundamental questions that need to be asked and answered so that we know where we stand and we can avoid injustice and bloodshed. Basic, simple questions. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go to court, file documents seeking a judicial review, probably 5 or 6 questions at a time. I'm going to reveal what these questions are so the opposing party knows in part what's coming or what could be coming, and they can, if they wish, try to argue against seeking a judicial determination to have these things answered, which identifies them as very, very bad government, or they can argue on the side of the state boot, which again, to the people in the public, it's going to be identified as bad government. The very first question, seriously, really, are the police above the law, or are they subject to the Criminal Code of Canada? If they're above the law, say so right now. Do so publicly. Let's know about it. But if they're not, then everything else I ask is going to be based upon them being subject to the Criminal Code of Canada, with us stating clearly an intent to use it against them. Everything they get away with rests upon them ignoring the basic fundamental concept of equality. And that's what we need. We need more equality back, and we need these cops to recognize that they too are bound by the Criminal Code of Canada, and that Criminal Code of Canada does in fact empower us to hire each other as peace officers. One of the issues that I don't like with the existing state of affairs is how police officers feel that they have a right and a duty to demand that we identify ourselves to them when they're a peace officer. Now, I've got no problem with that, but what I don't like is I've heard tell of people who, when asked to give a last name, they say, well, I have a family name, and they were charged with obstruction of justice for failure to acknowledge a last name. Human beings don't have last names, they have family names, and what this cop was trying to do was create joinder between his principal and the man using a name that sounds very similar to his own. But if you call it a family name and not a last name, they don't have the claim that they otherwise would have. The problem that I see is that when they say, I want to see identification, I demand you identify yourself, it's very ambiguous. It's pretty much left up to the cops, and they often demand to see government-issued identification. Now, the problem with it is it's government-issued, not merely government-provided, government-sanctioned, government-recognized, but government-issued. If you hold ID issued to you by some party, that party has the power to command and order you about by virtue of that. In the Army, they issue you ID and then they start issuing you orders. And that's what we're facing now. Cops tell you to do something and you say, why? And they say, because I told you to. The only thing that makes sense is the fact that we are holding government-issued identification. They're acting as an agent for the government. And because of that, we are compelled to obey their orders. Now, the question is, what is sufficient for identifying yourself to a peace officer? Is, "Hi, I'm Rob," sufficient? Or are they going to ask for government-issued identification and insist on government-issued identification? If we have no obligation to request and submit for government-issued identification, we have no obligation to carry it, no obligation to have it, and no obligation to produce it upon demand. And, "Hi, I'm Rob Menard," should be more than sufficient for me to identify myself to them. If they insist on government-issued identification and then claim the right to assault you and beat you up for failure to not produce it, then we end up with a de facto situation where you are in fact obliged to have government-issued identification just to avoid being beat up by the people hired by that government to enforce its policies. So the fundamental question with that one is, are we obliged to have, hold, and produce upon demand government-issued identification? I say we're not. And I say the argument against it is the fact that the only way to get it is to submit application. And the court, in order to side with the boot, would have to claim that we have a duty to submit and apply. And it means to beg. So let the court make that distinction, or let them put the officers on notice. Now, cops, when they ask you for identification, if they are only willing to accept government-issued identification, and yet we don't have any obligation to have government-issued identification, then the circumstance which is created is that people are getting government-issued identification just to avoid being beat up by the police. And that shouldn't be the case. We should be able to create our own identification, issue it ourselves, and serve them with copies and say, here's my identification, this identifies me, and yet no party issued it, and so no party would have a legal claim of authority over you. However, they don't like that. They insist on government-issued identification. You don't have that, they bring you to jail. This is the Canada we're living in, because the people who are making the words, who are creating the statutes, these people know that we have no obligation to have government-issued identification. We have no obligation to hold it, no obligation to produce it upon demand. But they craft words that are ambiguous enough that they would cause these police officers, who are heady in their desire to protect us from our own rights, these people can interpret it in a manner that allows them to think that we have a duty to have government-issued identification and produce it upon demand. This has got to stop. If you look at what some of the requirements are for flying in Canada, we have a right to travel. But if you try flying in Canada nowadays without government-issued identification, not merely government-recognized or provided, actual government-issued, then you're not allowed on the plane. And what's very sneaky about it, by applying for government-issued identification, you abandon your right to fly in exchange for a privilege to fly requiring government permission. And when they put you on the list, the no-fly list, what they are doing is saying, we have revoked this person's permission to fly, which means you're not exercising a right at all. But if you don't have government-issued identification, there is simply no way for them to legally claim that they have revoked your permission because you weren't relying on their permission. It all boils down to holding identification issued by a party and the amount of authority that grants the issuing party over you because you decided to submit and apply.